Yeah, legit. I didn't call this. So the review embargo is up for Wonder Woman, and the reviews are good. They're really good. They're great. And that is a good thing. I think that might come as a surprise to some people who remember my incredibly angry, ranty video about how I wanted the DCEU to fail. However, if you actually go back and watch it, which I'd encourage you to do, I wouldn't mind the extra views, at about the 2-minute mark, I do say that if Wonder Woman is great, it might alter my opinion, but I gave my thoughts at that time. And I still stand by those thoughts at the time that I have them. But you know what? I'm human. I'm allowed to have my opinions change. And I did say in that video that if Wonder Woman is great, I will go see it. I had made the assumption I was not going to go see it because at that point in time, I didn't see in my head any scenario in which that movie was going to be great. I figured the best it was going to be was decent, better than BVS or Suicide Squad. And for me, that wasn't going to be good enough. I wanted overwhelming, just this is a terrific movie, not just in comparison to what the DCEU has been, but in and of itself, it's great. Go see it. And that appears to be the consensus. Now, I personally, at the time of this recording, have not seen the movie yet. I do intend to. I do intend to do a review, but I haven't seen it yet. But even if I don't like it, that is not going to impact anything I'm going to say here, because I want to talk about how this may or may not affect the DCEU going forward. We got to start with some numbers though. Now, the Rotten Tomatoes score at the time of this recording is still hovering in the low 90s. Now, as more reviews come in, odds are that might go down a little bit more. That's not a guarantee. I expect it to settle either in the very high 80s or the very low 90s, which is still really good, even if it dips under 90%. That is really good. I don't want to focus too much on the Rotten Tomatoes percentage though. I would rather talk about the Rotten Tomatoes average score, because the problem with the percentage, and people who know enough about Rotten Tomatoes understand this, is it gives you a broad stroke, but a 90 something percent approval rating doesn't mean like it's 97% or whatever of the best movie ever. It just says that most of the reviewers, that percentage of reviewers had more positives than negatives. Where things get dicey is Rotten Tomatoes has to assign a positive or negative to what sometimes can be a very split review. If somebody's really of two minds, and if you read the reviews kind of on the fence, Rotten Tomatoes has to decide, do we count this positive? Do we count this negative? And that can end up skewing results in either direction. So I want to scrap the percentage and that rating. So forget it. Let's talk average. So right now, at the time of this recording, Wonder Woman is sitting at a 7.6 average score. Now, in and of itself, if you aren't used to looking at the average score, that may not sound that great. That's about a C if you were to put it into a school grading system. But let's do a little bit of comparison. The best rated DCEU was Man of Steel. That clocked in at a 6.2. Batman v Superman landed at a 4.9. Suicide Squad got a 4.7. So this is already head and shoulders much better than anything that the DCEU has put out. So let's compare it to some other stuff that has come out. If we want to go by just what's come out this year, Logan had a 7.9, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 had a 7.8. So that, I think, gives you a slightly more realistic metric. Now, that's not, depending on tone, those might not be accurate things to compare to, but just looking at score, this is good. This is very good. This is up there with movies that have come out this year that have been very successful and pretty well received by both critics and audiences. So this is all good stuff. And I am legitimately happy about this. I know I have my whole rant about how I wanted the whole DCEU to fail, but you need to remember the reason I wanted it to fail was because I saw no possible way that it was ever going to get good, and I just wanted it to crash now so that we could start over and build something better. What we're seeing right now with these reviews is the outcome that I didn't dare to dream was possible. This is great. I'm ecstatic. So the question now becomes, can this save the DCEU? Short answer, no, not by itself, but maybe it can get things pushed in the correct direction. A lot of that's going to come down to how it does at the box office though. So let's take a quick look at those numbers. Right now, it's on track to do 175 million in its international on its opening weekend, because it's opening in US and international at the same time. Now that sounds really good, but I kind of want to narrow the focus to just talk domestic, just so because it makes for an easier point of comparison. So domestically, it's on track right now for a $75 million opening weekend. Now, it may come in above that, it may come in after that, but for right now, let's just treat the estimates as the most likely and move forward. 75 million is respectable. It's pretty good for a blockbuster tentpole superhero movie based off one of the best known superhero characters. It sounds a little on the weak side, though. I mean, Guardians of the Galaxy 2 did about twice that, but as soon as I checked that number, I also realized that's not a fair comparison because that's a sequel to an already established franchise. So I think a more fair comparison might be the first Guardians of the Galaxy, which was a more of an unknown property, did 93 million domestically on its opening weekend, or more recently than that, Doctor Strange, again, first entry in that particular franchise, while still being part of a bigger shared universe, that did 85 million domestic on its opening weekend. So Wonder Woman is coming a little bit behind those. Now, it's still in that ballpark, so it's playing in that club, but it is a little bit behind until you really start looking at the context and realize how much this thing is fighting against. First of all, it's fighting against the stigma against the DCEU itself. Now, you may love the DCEU movies. If you do, great. I am happy for you. I'm glad you got enjoyment. But even if you like this stuff, even if you don't like the fact that a lot of people appear to not like it, you can't argue with the fact that these films have been divisive at best, and they haven't been universally loved. So this thing getting that kind of critical praise is great, but in terms of the opening weekend box office, the movie is kind of, it's got to pull against a stigma from audiences who have gotten possibly up to 3 movies that they didn't like. And then you add to that the additional stigma against female-led tentpole style franchise films. I mean, we don't really have a ton of points of comparison for this. That's how uncommon this is, and most of the times you can think of it, it's been a disaster. I mean, in terms of superheroes, Catwoman, Elektra, Supergirl, ugh. But if you want to look at something more recently, last year we had the female-led Ghostbusters. Now, I'm not saying that the fact that these were why these movies failed or underperformed. A lot of them had a lot of problems completely aside from that, but it still creates a stigma. It creates this idea that superhero-led movies aren't good and don't make money. So it's got to fight against that too. So when you factor that context in, a $75 million opening is pretty solid. What's really gonna make or break this thing though is whether or not it has legs. So this thing needs to keep strong in the following weekends and not have a massive drop-off. Because a massive drop-off, I mean, a big opening weekend, especially if you win the opening weekend, that sounds good and all, but if it has a massive drop-off after that, that's still a problem. Alien Covenant had a 71% drop-off from its premiere weekend to this past one. Wonder Woman can't afford to take that kind of hit. Batman v Superman, another example, that had a 69% drop-off from its first weekend to its next one. Now that one, even though ultimately it did come shy of what the projections for it were, it could still afford that hit because its opening weekend was so huge. It was a $200 million plus opening weekend. So even though it took a very big hit the next weekend, it was still a big enough number that it added up. When you're opening at 75 million, you need legs. You've got to keep going strong, and the reviews are probably going to go a good way towards ensuring that that happens. It doesn't guarantee it, but it certainly helps because generally the opening weekend is the opening weekend. People who want to see it right away are going to see it right away regardless of what the critics say. But people who aren't rushing to see it out the first weekend and are deciding a week, 2, 3 weeks later, do I want to see this? They are more likely to be affected by the critical reviews going, oh, well, there's this new thing out, but there was Wonder Woman and everyone said that was great. I'll go see that. So the critical reviews could really help this thing have the legs that it needs. Now, in terms of the money that it needs to make, official budget that has come in is $149 million. Who knows how accurate that actually is? Hollywood accounting, but that's the number, that's the official budget, so let's just go with it. Now, $149 million is actually a somewhat conservative budget in the world of superhero movies at this point. A lot of them are closer to $200 million or north of a $200 million budget. So this is, I don't want to say that it's a cheap movie. A more cheap superhero movie would be Logan, Deadpool, those kinds of things. But this is still not quite the bloated budget that some of the films we've gotten lately has had. So the hard and fast, dirty rule of thumb is that for a movie to start making a profit, it has to double its production budget. Now, again, Hollywood accounting specifics, maybe it needs to make a little bit more than that, maybe it doesn't need to make quite that much, but that's the rule of thumb. That's the hard and fast rule. And right now, at $175 million opening weekend internationally, it does look on track to at least make its budget back. So then it's a question of how far can it go past that in terms of being a legitimate hit instead of merely being profitable, because that is a difference in terms of how the executives at Warner Brothers are going to react to this. If it's just profitable, great, we'll probably get a Wonder Woman sequel. They'll keep her around as they retool other things and get it figured out. But if it's a hit, if it's a legitimate, whoa, that was bigger than we thought it was going to be hit, they might actually do what I wanted them to do, what I wanted them to do, and what the point of my I want the DCEU movies to fail video was, which is that I want them to change their approach. Now, at the time I made that video, I did honestly believe the only thing that was going to change their approach was for the whole thing to just crash and burn. Well, I'm going to shift that opinion, and I'm now going to pin a fair amount of hope on Wonder Woman. Now, Wonder Woman's not going to fix everything because we're still going to get Justice League, and the state of Justice League right now, it's in a rough place. Again, even if you like BVS and you like Zack Snyder, with the tragedy that happened with him losing his daughter, which is horrible. It is an absolutely terrible thing that happened. And I have nothing but sympathy and condolences for the man and his family. Now, he moved off the project. Joss Whedon is now finishing up the post-production. I didn't talk about this last week because I was traveling. The videos I uploaded last week I had recorded ahead of time because I wasn't going to be able to shoot anything. That was a quick reaction to what was going on. So I haven't actually talked about this before. But just realistically, a new filmmaker coming in, no matter how good that filmmaker is, and they're coming in and they have to assemble somebody else's work into something coherent on a deadline, that's a rough setup. It's not insurmountable, but Joss Whedon's storytelling instincts are not the same as Zack Snyder's. That's not me definitively saying one is better than the other. People have their preferences, that's fine, but they are different filmmakers. The kinds of things that Joss Whedon makes, you can look at Serenity, you can look at the Avengers, you can look at his TV work. It is very different on a lot of levels from what Zack Snyder has done. So, as much as I may like Joss Whedon, he doesn't seem like the most natural fit to take the pieces that were conceived and assembled by Zack Snyder and put them together in a film. Again, that's not to say it's impossible, but even if you thought that Justice League was on the right track, which personally I didn't and still don't, that's an awkward position to put a film into its post-production. So the deck is stacked against Justice League working. Now, the deck is stacked against it in a completely different way from the way the deck was stacked against Wonder Woman, because that was all more sort of stigma and baggage. This is the logistics, the nuts and bolts of the production, and now the post-production is making it harder for Justice League to turn out to be a good movie. And personally, I don't think it will be. I didn't think it would be back when Zack Snyder was still on it. My opinion does not alter with Joss Whedon finishing up. So in my personal opinion, Justice League is a lost cause, kind of was from the word go, because it was conceived and put into motion well before the very divisive reaction to BVS came out. Now, they did say that they were trying to make some adjustments to the film and in the wake of BVS, but the shooting picked up so quickly that in my mind, they say, oh, we'll make it lighter. You don't have time to restructure the script, so whatever the structure and the overall tone of the thing, that's gonna be locked in. All you can do to make it lighter is paste some jokes over the thing, and that's not really the same thing. Not to mention the fact that trying to rejigger and reconfigure a film while you're shooting it, as opposed to getting all that sorted out before you start shooting, rarely results in a polished, clean, cohesive final product. So, I'm sorry guys, even though Wonder Woman, by all accounts, is great, you know what, I'm not gonna say by all accounts, I'm gonna say it is great. Even if I end up not particularly liking it, the consensus is that it's great. We'll just go with that. Wonder Woman being great does not suddenly mean that Justice League is going to be great, because the two were basically happening almost at the same time. I mean, Wonder Woman a little bit ahead of it, but they were happening kind of in parallel and independent of each other. What this could affect would be what happens after. So we're talking Aquaman, we're talking The Flash, if they ever get that thing pulled together. We're talking Cyborg, if that still happens. We're talking the various Batman-related movies. Nightwing, Batgirl, the Batman, all of that. If Wonder Woman is the hit that it needs to be, and I'm gonna say that right now, it needs to be a hit. It needs to be a big hit. It needs to blow out this weekend, bigger than they're expecting, and it needs to have legs, and it needs to keep winning. I want it to win first of the box office 3 weekends in a row. That's what I want right now. Because the film is the most detached from the rest of the DCEU. It's detached from all the logistics of what has gone on in that world. It's set so far ahead in the timeline that it's able to have its own identity. So what I hope is that this thing is a hit. Warner Brothers looks at it and realizes that the film that was the most independent of everything else, that wasn't bogged down in world building, but was just telling a story, saying, here's our character, here's our story, let's tell the story the best that we can. Because the big problems, the big sort of starting problems, because there would be later ones as the things got shot and got edited and whatever, with both BVS and Suicide Squad, is they felt more like world building exercises than they did telling proper stories in and of themselves, especially Batman v Superman. By all accounts, with Wonder Woman, Warner Brothers gave Patty Jenkins whatever parameters they wanted to give her, and then they appear to have, for the most part, have left her alone, which is good because they usually don't. Warner Brothers does not leave its filmmakers alone. What they did to Suicide Squad was completely ruined it, assuming it even possibly could have been that good in the first place. I think that's debatable. And Batman v Superman, I still haven't seen the ultimate cut, but every fan I know, and even people who don't like the movie, still admit the ultimate cut was better. So they still force Zack Snyder to put together something less coherent for the theatrical release. So I'll reiterate what I said in my last really angry rant video about the DCEU. Warner Brothers is the problem, not these individual filmmakers, not these creative teams. Warner Brothers as an organization is the problem, but they listen to money. So if Wonder Woman can really nail the box office and keep nailing it weekend after weekend, maybe they will look at this and realize that what they allowed Patty Jenkins to do was similar to what they allowed Christopher Nolan to do with Batman, which was to get someone who had a vision to go in and do it. Now, arguably, they also did that with Zack Snyder with the movies that he has directed, but it may just be that the man's not a good fit to the material. One would have thought that he would be, but also one would have thought Michael Bay would be a good fit for Transformers, but somehow things just don't click. That happens sometimes. But Warner Brothers has gone in and made it worse when they've micromanaged. I think, again, Suicide Squad exemplifies that really amazing. So if Wonder Woman works, and if then, oh boy, if Aquaman works, we might finally be on the track. And interestingly enough, it'll basically be a case of the movies that logically should have been made before the team up started happening turn out being the good ones. Maybe that they will start focusing, rather than everything being focused around how big this world is and how everything's interconnected. Instead, we just focus on, okay, here's the character, tell this character's story, which is really what they should have done from the beginning, and they only have done with Man of Steel up to this point. Everything else has been this just cluster mess of a ton of elements that, again, feel more like world-building exercises than proper stories, or at the very least, they're trying to split the difference between the two. You need to just tell a story. That's what the audience wants. We want a good story. World building is fine and it allows you to do other things, but that can't be the point of the movie. It's the same mistake that Sony made with The Amazing Spider-Man 2. It was all about setting things up for the future movies, and they told an incoherent mess. So Wonder Woman is great. I'm so happy for that. I'll have my proper review out hopefully tomorrow, maybe Friday morning, we'll see. So you'll get my full thoughts on the film itself, but right now I just wanted to talk its possible, hopeful, positive impact on the DCEU as a whole. Fingers crossed, because I would really like to be looking forward to these movies instead of looking at the release schedule with a sense of dread. But for right now, I'm excited to see this movie, and I didn't think I was going to be able to say that, ever. And you know what? Sometimes it's nice to be wrong. So those are my thoughts on the critical reception for Wonder Woman and its box office potential. What are your thoughts on all of this and how it might impact the DCEU? Whatever they are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, check me out on Twitter at Council of Geeks. Give a listen to the Council of Geeks podcast, available on iTunes and Stitcher. And until next time, this council is adjourned.